She had stopped counting how many times she had heard the same words, too old, too quiet, too late for love, and every time someone said it, a small part of her heart quietly folded in on itself. But on a rainy evening when the world felt heavier than usual, a broke restaurant owner looked at her tired eyes and said something no one had ever said before: "You're exactly who I need." And in that single moment a story began that neither of them expected. Margaret Collins was 58 years old, and the world had a strange way of making women like her feel invisible. Her hair had turned soft silver long before she was ready to accept it, and the lines on her face told stories no one ever asked to hear. She had spent most of her life caring for others, first her parents, then her husband, and later the small home they built together in a quiet neighborhood where every house looked almost the same. For 32 years she had been a wife who cooked warm dinners, folded freshly washed clothes, and waited patiently for her husband to come home from long workdays. But life had a cruel habit of changing direction without warning. One winter morning her husband Daniel left for work like he always did, kissing her on the forehead and promising they would finally take that trip to the ocean they had been postponing for years. He never came home. A truck driver who had fallen asleep at the wheel erased 32 years of shared memories in a matter of seconds. After the funeral the house became painfully silent. The ticking clock on the wall sounded louder than it ever had, and the empty chair at the dinner table felt like a wound that never healed. For the first year Margaret barely stepped outside. But bills do not care about grief, and savings do not last forever. Eventually she had to search for work. At 58 the world did not make it easy. Every interview ended the same way: they smiled politely, thanked her for coming, and told her they were looking for someone more energetic, someone more modern, someone who could keep up with the fast pace, which was simply another way of saying someone younger. Margaret would nod with quiet dignity, walk out of the building, and sit in her car for a few minutes before driving home, not because she was angry but because she was tired of feeling like her life had quietly expired in the eyes of everyone else. On one particular afternoon she sat in a small cafe watching people walk past the window: young couples laughing, students rushing with backpacks, mothers pulling children by the hand, life moving forward while hers felt paused somewhere in the past. She noticed a small restaurant across the street. The sign above the door flickered like it had not been replaced in years, and only 2 tables inside were occupied. A young man stood behind the counter arguing with a delivery driver while trying to keep 3 pots from boiling over. Something about the chaos made Margaret smile faintly. The next day she returned and walked inside. The place smelled like garlic butter and fresh bread, but it also carried the quiet stress of a business barely surviving. The young man looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, his apron covered in flour. He glanced at her quickly while stirring a large pot. "Welcome, give me 5 minutes. Everything is a disaster today," he said with a nervous laugh. Margaret sat quietly watching him run between the stove and the tables. She could see it clearly: the burnt edges on the bread, the unevenly plated pasta, the confusion in the kitchen. Not because the man lacked effort, but because he was trying to do everything alone. When he finally placed a bowl of soup in front of her he sighed heavily. "Sorry about the wait." Margaret tasted the soup slowly. It was good, very good actually, but the presentation was rushed, the seasoning slightly uneven. "You need to lower the heat when you add the cream," she said gently, "otherwise it separates." The young man froze. "How did you know that?" Margaret gave a small shy smile. "I cooked for a family every day for 32 years. He studied her face carefully for a moment, then he laughed softly. "Well, if you know how to keep cream from betraying me, you probably know more about cooking than I do right now." His name was Leo Martinez. He was 32 years old and had poured every dollar he owned into opening this tiny restaurant after years of dreaming about it. But dreams are expensive and reality had arrived quickly. Staff quit after 2 weeks, suppliers demanded payments, customers complained about slow service, and every night Leo locked the doors wondering if the restaurant would survive another month. Margaret finished her soup quietly, then she stood up and walked toward the counter. "You should move the bread station closer to the stove," she said calmly. "You are wasting steps every minute." Leo blinked. She pointed toward the kitchen. "Your herbs are drying out under that light, and the soup pot is too big for your burner, which is why it takes so long to heat." "For the next 10 minutes," she calmly explained. Small changes that could make the kitchen Run smoother. Leo listened like a student discovering a teacher he never expected. Finally, he asked the question that surprised even himself. Do you want a job? Margaret laughed softly, almost embarrassed. Oh no, I was just offering advice. Leo shook his head firmly. No, I'm serious. You see things I don't. You notice problems before they happen. Margaret looked down at her hands. Every place I applied told me I'm too old for restaurant work. Leo leaned against the counter thinking carefully. Then he said the words that changed everything. Yuri, not too old. Yuri, exactly who I need. Margaret stared at him, unsure whether to believe it. Why would you hire someone my age? Leo shrugged with a tired smile. Because experience is something I can't buy, and right now my restaurant is drowning, so if you're willing to help me save it, I'll take all the wisdom you have. For the first time in years, Margaret felt something unfamiliar. Hope. She started the next morning. At first, customers assumed she was just someone's mother helping temporarily, but within weeks the restaurant changed. Margaret reorganized the kitchen, simplified the menu, and taught Leo small techniques that transformed his cooking. She greeted every guest with warmth that made strangers feel like family. Regular customers began returning more often. Reviews slowly improved, and the small restaurant that once felt like it was gasping for air started breathing again. But something else changed too. Leo began noticing how Margaret carried quiet strength in everything she did. She never raised her voice, never rushed, never complained. She simply solved problems with patience and kindness. One night, after closing, Leo sat across from her at a small table. You know something, he said, this place would already be closed if you hadn't walked in that day. Margaret smiled gently. Sometimes people just need someone to believe they're not finished yet. Leo looked at her thoughtfully. You know, the strange thing, everyone told me I was crazy for opening a restaurant with no experience, and everyone told you were too old to start over. Margaret nodded slowly. Looks like we both ignored them. Months passed and the restaurant became known across the neighborhood, not because it was the fanciest place but because it felt real. People came for the food, but they returned for the warmth Margaret created. One evening a young woman asked Margaret something unexpected. Are you the owner? Margaret laughed softly. No dear, just someone who got a second chance. But Leo, standing behind the counter, overheard the conversation, and later that night he placed a small envelope on the table in front of her. Margaret opened it slowly. Inside was a legal document, half ownership of the restaurant. Her eyes filled with tears. Leo shook his head gently. You didn't just help me build this place, you saved it, and honestly you saved me too. Margaret looked around the warm little restaurant filled with laughter and clinking dishes. For years the world had told her she was too old to begin again, but standing there she realized something powerful. Life does not measure worth by age, it measures it by heart, and sometimes the people the world overlooks are the very ones capable of changing everything, because the truth is no one is ever too old to be exactly what someone else needs, and sometimes the moment you believe your story is ending is actually the moment it is finally beginning. Margaret held the paper in her hands for a long moment, as if it were something fragile, something that could disappear if she moved too quickly. Her fingers trembled slightly and the restaurant around her felt suddenly quiet, even though the dishes were still clinking in the kitchen and the soft hum of the refrigerator filled the air. Leo watched her carefully, unsure if he had done the right thing. Margaret finally looked up and her eyes were filled with tears she had not allowed herself to shed in years. I cannot accept this, she whispered softly. Leo frowned. Why not? Because this place is your dream, you built it. Leo shook his head slowly. No, I started it, but you turned it into something real. He pointed around the room. Look at this place, Margaret. People stay longer now, they laugh here, they celebrate birthdays here, they bring their parents and their children. That did not happen before you walked through the door. Margaret lowered her eyes again as memories quietly stirred inside her. For years she had felt like a chapter of life that everyone had already finished reading, but standing in this warm little restaurant she felt like someone had opened the book again. Still she hesitated. People might talk, she said quietly. A young man giving half his restaurant to an older woman. Leo laughed softly. People always talk. If we listened to them we would both still be sitting alone wondering what might have been. Margaret let out a slow breath and finally nodded. That night they closed the restaurant together as they always did, but something inside Margaret had changed. The next morning she arrived earlier than usual, unlocking the front door while the sky was still pale with early light. She walked slowly through the quiet dining room, touching the backs of chairs, straightening small things that did not really need fixing. For the first time in a long time she felt like she truly belonged somewhere, but life rarely allows happiness to settle without testing it first. A few weeks later a man in an expensive suit walked into The restaurant just before lunch. He carried the confident posture of someone used to making decisions that affected other people. Leo greeted him politely, thinking he was just another customer, but the man did not sit down. Instead, he studied the restaurant carefully, his eyes scanning every corner. Finally, he introduced himself. "My name is Richard Hale. I represent a restaurant group that has been purchasing small establishments in this neighborhood." Leo felt his stomach tighten slightly. Margaret quietly paused near the counter, listening. The man continued, speaking smoothly. "Your restaurant has become surprisingly popular in a very short time, which means it would fit perfectly into our expansion plans." Leo crossed his arms slowly. "And what exactly does that mean?" "It means we would like to buy this place, a very generous offer, more money than you likely expected when you opened this business." Leo glanced toward Margaret for a moment before answering. "I appreciate the offer, but this restaurant is not for sale." Richard Hale smiled the way businessmen often do when they assume the answer will eventually change. "Everyone has a price." He placed a business card on the counter. "Think about it carefully. Running a restaurant is exhausting and risky. You could walk away with a comfortable life instead." Then he left as calmly as he had arrived. The door closed softly behind him. For several seconds neither Leo nor Margaret spoke. Finally Leo sighed. "Well, that was strange." Margaret looked thoughtful rather than surprised. "Big companies buy places like this," she said quietly, "especially when they see potential." Leo picked up the card and turned it over in his fingers. "He offered a lot of money, more than I have ever seen." Margaret studied his face carefully. "But you are not thinking about selling?" Leo shook his head. "No, this place is not just a business anymore, it is something else." Margaret smiled gently. "It is a home." But over the next few days things began to change in ways they did not expect. Two new restaurants opened on the same street almost overnight, both modern, both heavily advertised, and both selling food very similar to Leo's menu. Customers became curious. Some nights the tables were not as full as they had been before. Leo tried to ignore the worry growing inside him, but Margaret noticed. One evening after closing, she sat across from him again, just like the night he had offered her the partnership. "You are thinking about that offer now?" she said calmly. Leo rubbed his forehead. "Maybe a little." Margaret nodded slowly. "That is normal when someone waves security in front of you. It is hard not to look." Leo looked up at her. "What would you do?" Margaret leaned back in her chair, remembering something from long ago. "When my husband and I bought our house, everyone told us it was too old, too much work. They said we should sell it and buy something newer." Leo listened quietly, but Daniel looked at me one night and said something I never forgot. "A home becomes valuable because of the life inside it, not because of how shiny the walls are." She gestured around the restaurant. "This place is the same." Leo let her words settle slowly, but the next challenge came sooner than either of them expected. One afternoon the city inspector arrived unexpectedly. Health regulations, paperwork, permits, things that normally passed without issue suddenly became problems. Shelves that had been acceptable for months were now considered incorrect. Suppliers were questioned. Small details were turned into large obstacles. Leo felt the pressure tightening like a storm building over the restaurant, and deep down he knew exactly who was responsible: Richard Hale and his company. Margaret watched everything with the calm patience she had carried her entire life. While Leo grew frustrated, she simply began solving each problem one by one. New shelves were installed, the kitchen was reorganized again, paperwork was corrected, and every evening when Leo looked like he might collapse from exhaustion, Margaret quietly reminded him of something important: storms do not last forever. Weeks passed. The bigger restaurants nearby slowly lost their early excitement. Customers began returning to Leo's restaurant again because shiny places could not replace something genuine. One evening the dining room was full again, laughter rising from nearly every table. Leo stood behind the counter watching Margaret greet guests like an old friend welcoming people into her home. A young couple asked if they could take a photo with her. Another family thanked her for remembering their favorite dishes, and suddenly Leo understood something powerful. The success of the restaurant was never about the food alone, it was about the heart that Margaret had placed inside it. Later that night when they closed the doors, Leo noticed someone sitting alone at a corner table. Richard Hale, the businessman, looked around the restaurant quietly before standing up. "You built something unusual here," he admitted. Leo crossed his arms cautiously. "We just built something honest." Richard nodded slowly. "That is exactly why my company wanted it, but I can See now that some places cannot be bought. He walked toward the door, then paused beside Margaret. You proved something my industry often forgets, he said calmly. Experience and kindness are far more powerful than youth and speed. Then he left without another word. The restaurant grew even stronger after that. Years later, people in the neighborhood still told the story of the tiny restaurant that survived against bigger competitors, but Margaret knew the real truth was much simpler. Two people the world had underestimated had simply refused to believe they were finished. One evening, long after closing, Margaret stood outside the restaurant watching the lights glow warmly through the windows. Leo stepped beside her holding 2 cups of tea. You know, he said softly, if you had not walked in here that rainy afternoon, my life would look completely different. Margaret smiled gently into the night air. If you had not said those words, my life would still be standing still. Leo looked at her curiously. Which words? Margaret repeated them quietly, the way someone repeats a memory that changed everything. Yuri, exactly who I need. She took a slow sip of tea and looked at the small restaurant filled with warmth, laughter, and second chances. For years the world had told her she was too old, too late, too forgotten, but life had proven something far more beautiful. Sometimes the right moment arrives long after everyone else thinks it should, and sometimes the greatest chapters of a life are written when people believe the story is already over, because the truth is a heart that still hopes is never too old, and a life that still has kindness to give is never finished. The restaurant continued to grow slowly but steadily, and with every passing month it felt less like a business and more like a living story written by the people who walked through its doors. Margaret had become the quiet soul of the place. Customers did not simply come to eat anymore, they came to see her, to share pieces of their lives, to sit near the warm smile that made every person feel like they mattered. Some people called her Mama Margaret even though she never asked for such a title. Leo watched it happened with a mixture of pride and quiet amazement. When he first opened the restaurant, he believed success meant packed tables and good reviews, but Margaret had taught him something deeper. Success was the feeling people carried when they walked back out the door. One evening during the busy dinner rush, a young woman walked inside holding the hand of a small boy. The child looked nervous, hiding slightly behind his mother while staring around the room. Margaret approached them with the same warmth she offered everyone. Hello there, sweetheart, she said gently, bending slightly to meet the boy's eyes. The boy looked up slowly. My mom says this place has the best soup. Margaret laughed softly. Well, your mother sounds like a very wise woman. The boy smiled for the first time. They sat near the window and Margaret made sure their meal was prepared carefully. After dinner, the woman approached the counter with tears quietly forming in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Margaret looked surprised. For what, dear? The woman hesitated before speaking. My son lost his father last year. He barely talks to anyone anymore, but tonight he laughed. Margaret felt a soft ache in her chest because she understood that pain better than most people ever could. She gently placed her hand over the woman's. Sometimes hearts just need a safe place to breathe again. The woman nodded before leaving with her son. Leo had been watching from the kitchen doorway. You do that a lot, he said quietly when the door closed. Margaret looked confused. Do what? Make people feel like life is not as heavy as they thought. Margaret gave a thoughtful smile. Maybe that is the real reason this place exists, but life was preparing another chapter for them, one that neither expected. One cold morning, Margaret arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. She moved a little slower than normal, but she brushed it aside, telling herself she had simply slept poorly. Leo noticed it too, but Margaret insisted she was fine. Days passed and the small fatigue remained. She still worked, greeted customers, and managed the kitchen, but sometimes she needed to sit down for a few minutes. One afternoon, Leo finally spoke firmly. Margaret, you need to see a doctor, she sighed softly. Doctors always find problems even when there are none. Leo crossed his arms stubbornly, and ignoring problems does not make them disappear. Reluctantly, she agreed. The appointment was simple and quick, but the doctor's expression changed after reading the test results. Margaret sat quietly listening to words she never expected to hear again. A heart condition, not immediately dangerous but serious enough that stress and long working hours could make it worse. The doctor spoke gently. You must slow down. You have spent a lifetime caring for others, but now your body is asking you to care for yourself. Margaret left the clinic carrying those words heavily in her mind. That evening she sat across from Leo after closing. I think I need to step away from the restaurant for a while, she said softly. Leo felt the words like a sudden drop in the floor beneath him. What do you mean step away? The doctor says my heart needs rest. Leo shook his head slowly as if refusing to accept the idea. But this place needs you. Margaret smiled with a quiet wisdom that only time could give. Leo, every life eventually reaches a moment where it must trust what it has built. You do not need me the way you once did. Leo stared at her. But I want you here. Margaret reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. And I will always be part of this place, but sometimes love means letting things continue without holding them too tightly. For the first time since he opened the restaurant, Leo felt the same fear he had felt in those early struggling days, but Margaret's calm presence softened it. Over the next few weeks she reduced her hours slowly. The staff Leo had hired over the years stepped forward, learning the routines she had once carried alone. Margaret still visited often, but she no longer rushed through the kitchen or carried trays across the dining room. Instead, she sat among the guests, listening to their stories like a quiet guardian of the place. The restaurant did not fall apart the way Leo secretly feared. In fact, something beautiful happened. Everything Margaret had taught them continued living through the people around her. One evening, nearly 2 years after the day she first walked through the door, the restaurant celebrated its anniversary. The dining room was decorated with small lights and photos from the past years, pictures of customers' birthdays, first dates, anniversaries, and smiling families covered the walls. At the center of the room, Leo stood holding a small microphone while everyone waited curiously. He looked toward Margaret, who sat near the window in the same seat she had chosen on that rainy day long ago. Most of you know this place as a restaurant, Leo began, but the truth is it became something much more. He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Years ago, I was a broke man, with a failing dream and a kitchen that felt like a battlefield. Then one afternoon a woman walked in and told me my soup pot was too big for my burner. The room filled with soft laughter. Leo smiled, but what she really did was show me that life never runs out of second chances. He walked toward Margaret holding a small wooden plaque. This restaurant exists because someone the world called too old refused to believe her story was finished. Margaret's eyes filled with quiet tears as the room erupted into warm applause. Leo placed the plaque in her hands. It read, simply Margaret Collins, the heart of this home. Margaret looked around the room at the faces smiling back at her, young couples, families, children, people whose lives had briefly touched hers, and she realized something powerful. For years she had believed her purpose ended when her husband left this world, but life had quietly been guiding her toward another beginning. Later that night, when the celebration ended, Leo walked Margaret to her car. They stood together under the soft glow of the streetlight. You know, he said gently, you changed more lives than you realize. Margaret smiled softly. No, Leo, we changed them together. She looked back at the restaurant one last time before getting into her car. The warm lights inside glowed like a beacon in the quiet street, and in that moment she understood the most beautiful truth life had ever taught her. Age does not close doors, fear does. The world may say it is too late, too difficult, too impossible, but sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to say something different. You're exactly who I need, and those simple words can turn an ending into the most meaningful beginning of all.